The crystal chandelier of the Croft estate shattered the ambient light, illuminating the exact moment Vivienne's world collapsed. She had just accidentally poured a glass of vintage Merlot over Alara's uniform, a calculated act to remind the hired help of their place in the hierarchy. But the elite crowd didn't gasp at the stained cotton. They gasped at Silas Thorne, the elusive billionaire. Every family in the room was desperate to court, stepping forward from the shadows. He didn't even look at Vivienne. He simply took out his monogrammed handkerchief, gently wiped Alara's hand, and spoke with a terrifying, unshakable calm. "Are you ready to leave, Miss Vance? The executive board is waiting for your analysis." The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute, heavy enough to suffocate the elite crowd gathered beneath the crystal chandeliers. Vivienne Croft stood utterly frozen, the empty wine glass trembling in her perfectly manicured hand. The carefully orchestrated humiliation she had planned for the evening's entertainment had backfired with catastrophic precision. Silas Thorne, a man whose mere signature could make or break a Fortune 500 empire, was looking at a domestic worker with more respect than he had shown any heiress in the room. Voice wavering, desperately attempting a forced laugh. "Mr. Thorne." "Silas, please. This is simply a misunderstanding. The girl is notoriously clumsy, and she frankly lacks the refinement required for an event of this caliber. I was merely trying to..." Cutting her off, his tone freezing the air. "Miss Croft, I do not recall ever granting you the familiarity to use my given name. Furthermore, I find your definition of clumsiness highly selective. It is mathematically remarkable how gravity only seems to affect your vintage wine when it is positioned directly above a subordinate." A few muffled gasps rippled through the suffocatingly quiet crowd. Vivienne's face flushed a deep, mottled crimson as her social capital evaporated in real time. She had built her entire identity on superiority, and Silas had just dismantled it with 3 sentences. Silas turned his unyielding attention back to Alara. Despite the cold, clinging fabric of her ruined uniform and the humiliating circumstances, she stood remarkably tall. There were no tears of victimhood in her eyes, only a sharp, calculating intelligence that perfectly mirrored his own. Voice, impeccably steady, maintaining direct eye contact. "My apologies for the delay, Mr. Thorne. It appears my current, contractual obligations required a brief, albeit messy, renegotiation on the floor." A faint, almost imperceptible ghost of a smile touched Silas's lips. It was the exact response he had anticipated from her profile. Without affording another glance to the sputtering Vivienne or the gawking elite, he placed a firm, deeply respectful hand on Alara's shoulder, guiding her toward the heavy mahogany doors. As they exited into the crisp, biting night air, the suffocating opulence and toxic whispers of the Croft estate faded into irrelevance. Waiting in the circular driveway was a sleek, heavily armored Maybach. The seasoned chauffeur immediately opened the door, offering absolutely no reaction to Alara's stained attire. Once they were sealed inside the soundproof cabin, the ambient city lights washed over them in rhythmic flashes. The tension finally broke, leaving a heavy, expectant silence between the billionaire and the maid. Pouring a glass of sparkling water from the console and handing it to her. "You handled that orchestrated ambush with more grace than she deserved. However, I must admit, stepping in so publicly was a calculated risk. I needed to confirm if the brilliant mind who authored the anonymous restructuring algorithm for Vanguard Logistics was truly masquerading as a domestic servant." Taking the glass, her demeanor shifting instantly to pure corporate professionalism. "I wasn't masquerading, Mr. Thorne. My father's medical debts are crushing, and the Croft family controls the primary lending institutions in this district. They aggressively blacklisted me from the financial sector when I refused to doctor their quarterly reports. Serving their hors d'oeuvres was the only legal way to prevent our home from foreclosure." Leaning back into the leather seat, his eyes narrowing with focused intensity. "A temporary and pathetic setback designed by fragile egos. The executive board isn't actually waiting tonight, Alara. But they will be tomorrow morning, at 8 sharp. I am finalizing a hostile takeover of Croft Holdings, and I require a chief strategy officer who understands their structural weaknesses from the inside out." Alara looked down at the dark, spreading wine stain on her uniform, a symbol of her subjugation and then back up at the imposing man offering her a weapon to dismantle the very empire that had enslaved her family. The stinging humiliation of the evening was already burning away, rapidly replaced by the cold, bright fire of vindication. The morning sun cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Thorn Capital, illuminating a boardroom that felt more like a war room. Elara stood at the head of the expansive glass table. The stained cotton uniform of the previous night was gone, replaced by a sharply tailored, charcoal gray suit she had kept perfectly pressed for the day she would finally return to the corporate battlefield. She projected an aura of absolute competence, her posture rigid, her eyes scanning the complex financial schematics glowing on the digital display board. Around the table sat Silas's executive team, a cadre of ruthless financial veterans who looked at Elara with a mixture of intense curiosity and barely concealed skepticism. The whispers of the Croft estate had already permeated the morning gossip circuit. To them, she was simply the humiliated maid. Leaning forward, tapping his platinum pen aggressively against his notepad. With all due respect, Mr. Thorne, relying on a disgraced former analyst to spearhead a $3 billion acquisition seems reckless. The Crofts are heavily fortified. Furthermore, the rumors circulating from last night's gala suggest Miss Vance is a liability, heavily indebted and recently serving canapés. The silence that followed was deliberately allowed to stretch. Silas sat back in his leather chair, his expression unreadable, calmly sipping his black coffee. He didn't intervene. He wanted them to see exactly why he had brought her here. Stepping away from the screen, her voice ringing with crystalline authority. Mr. Kane, your intel is as superficial as Vivian Croft's social standing. The Crofts appear fortified only because they have been aggressively manipulating their Tier 1 capital ratios for the past 3 quarters. She pressed a button on her remote, and the screen shifted to a complex web of deeply buried subsidiary accounts, pointing to a specific cluster of red data points. They've been funneling toxic commercial real estate debt into shell companies masked as philanthropic trusts. I know this because I initially flagged the discrepancy 6 months ago, which is precisely why Arthur Croft blacklisted me from the financial district. If Thorn Capital initiates a massive short on their secondary bonds at the opening bell on Monday, we trigger a liquidity crisis they cannot legally conceal. They won't just be vulnerable to a takeover. They will be begging for one. The boardroom grew incredibly still. Marcus Kane stopped tapping his pen, staring at the irrefutable data laid out before him. The skepticism in the room evaporated, rapidly replaced by the predatory realization of a guaranteed victory. Setting his coffee cup down with a soft, definitive click. As I was saying, gentlemen, Miss Vance is now the Chief Strategy Officer of this firm. You will grant her the same operational authority you grant me. Coordinate with the legal department. Elara, we don't just want to acquire Croft Holdings. We will dismantle their infrastructure piece by piece. Halfway across the city, Vivian Croft lounged in her penthouse, blissfully unaware that her family's empire was currently being targeted by a precision strike. Speaking into her phone, her tone dripping with bored entitlement. Daddy? Yes, the party was fine. Silas Thorne was acting bizarre, though. He made a massive scene over that wretched maid. Honestly, the lower classes are so exhausting. Make sure she never finds employment in this city again, just to make a point. She hung up, smiling at her reflection in the gilded mirror, entirely ignorant that the woman she sought to crush was currently holding the detonator to her entire legacy. Monday morning arrived with the deceptive calm of a receding tide, just before a tsunami. Inside the penthouse office of Croft Holdings, Arthur Croft stood by his expansive window, overlooking the financial district. He adjusted his bespoke tie, sipping a freshly imported espresso, entirely confident in the impenetrable fortress of wealth his family had built over 3 generations. Speaking into his intercom, his voice projecting arrogant authority. Sandra, push the quarterly review to next week. I'm having lunch with the mayor today, and I want the press release regarding our new philanthropic trust distributed by noon. Ensure the language emphasizes our unwavering commitment to community development. But at exactly 9:30 a.m., the opening bell rang at the stock exchange, and Arthur's fortress began to crumble. Miles away, on the trading floor of Thorn Capital, Elara Vance stood behind a bank of glowing monitors. Her eyes were fixed on the real-time data streaming across the screens. Beside her, Silas Thorne stood with his arms crossed, an anchor of absolute stillness amidst the chaotic, adrenaline-fueled energy of the trading floor. Her voice slicing through the background noise, sharp, calm, and devastatingly precise. Execute the initial short on all Croft secondary bonds. Flood the market. Let the algorithmic trading bots detect the sudden volume spike. We need their primary lenders to panic and initiate margin calls within the first hour. Do not let up the pressure. The effect was instantaneous and brutal. As Thorne Capital dumped massive volumes of Croft debt into the market, algorithms triggered automatic, cascading sell-offs. Within 15 minutes, Croft Holdings' stock price plummeted by an unprecedented 12%. Back in the Croft executive suite, Arthur's private line began to flash violently. Snatching the receiver, his polished facade cracking immediately. What do you mean we are facing a margin call? From whom? The bonds are perfectly secure. We deliberately obscured the commercial debt in the row. He stops abruptly, his face draining of color, staring blankly at the wall. Who ordered the forensic audit? Vanguard Logistics? That's impossible. They don't have the leverage or the capital to demand. Wait, Thorne Capital is backing them? As Arthur scrambled desperately to stop the bleeding, Vivienne burst into his office, entirely oblivious to the financial slaughter occurring on the screens behind him. She was holding a collection of designer fabric swatches, her expression twisted into a pout of profound, petty annoyance. Sighing dramatically, tossing the silk fabric onto his heavy oak desk. Daddy, the event planner is being completely unreasonable about the floral arrangements for the summer gala. And to make matters worse, that wretched girl from the party, Alara, somehow got her father's medical debts consolidated overnight. I explicitly told you to have her blacklisted from every institution in this city. Slamming his fist onto the mahogany desk, a vein pulsing dangerously at his temple. Shut up about the gala, Vivienne. We are losing hundreds of millions of dollars by the minute. Someone has systematically bypassed our firewalls and exposed our Tier 1 capital ratios to the federal regulators. We are being gutted alive. Vivienne froze, the designer swatches scattering across the polished floor. For the first time in her sheltered, privileged existence, the protective bubble of her inherited power was rapidly deflating. At Thorne Capital, Silas watched the red lines on the graph plummet, representing the rapid dismantling of the Croft legacy. He turned his gaze to Alara, who was watching the same screen with an expression of icy, unwavering resolve. A low, appreciative murmur. They are bleeding out significantly faster than my senior analysts projected. You found the exact artery, Alara. Without taking her eyes off the cascading numbers. I didn't just find it, Mr. Thorne. I lived inside it. They built their empire on the backs of people they deemed invisible. Today, they learn that the invisible can see every crack in their foundation. Prepare the acquisition papers. By tomorrow morning, they will be crawling to us. The atmosphere in the Crofts' luxury car was stiflingly tense as it pulled into the Thorne Capital parking lot on Tuesday morning. In less than 24 hours, the entire financial empire Arthur Croft had painstakingly built had completely collapsed. Facing irreversible bankruptcy, Arthur had no choice but to personally beg for a buyout deal. Sitting beside him, Vivienne, still wearing her latest designer dress, tried to maintain her usual haughtiness despite the panic etched on her face. She insisted on coming along, clinging to the ridiculous illusion that her personal charm could persuade the billionaire Silas Thorne. Speaking irritably, constantly adjusting the folds of her silk dress. Dad, I really don't understand why we have to humble ourselves like this. Silas is a practical man. When he meets his daughter, he'll surely realize that a merger through a strategic marriage will yield more long-term benefits than a hostile takeover. He was only slightly distracted by the lowlifes at the party the other day. Rubbing his temples, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. Shut up, Vivienne. This isn't a high society social gathering. We're on the verge of losing everything. This building, the bank accounts, and the prestigious Croft name. Keep your mouth shut, behave yourself, and let me handle the negotiations. The high-speed glass elevator took them to the top floor, where Thorne Capital's central meeting room was located. As the sliding doors opened, Arthur hastily donned a false air of confidence and stepped inside. However, the scene that unfolded before him immediately choked any diplomatic greetings he might have offered. Silas Thorne wasn't sitting in his usual chairman's chair. He stood calmly by the transparent glass window, arms crossed, observing. The person seated in that central position of power, with the acquisition files neatly placed on the table, was Elara Vance. She wore a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit, exuding an absolute authority that seemed to drain the air from the large room. Eyes wide with astonishment, a shrill voice breaking the silence. "What the hell is going on? Why is that maid here?" "Mr. Thorne, I demand that you call security to have her kicked out immediately. She dares to sit in your director's chair." Slowly turning around, his icy gaze fixed on Vivian. "Miss Croft, I advise you to adjust your attitude immediately." The woman she had just addressed as Maid is now the Chief Strategy Officer of Thorne Capital. More importantly, she is the only one in this room with the power to decide whether her family will receive a meager retirement pension or face jail time for financial fraud. His face turns pale, he stumbles back a step. "No. This can't be true. Elara Vance? The daughter of that debt-ridden man? She stole our internal data. This is clearly industrial espionage." Slowly opening the file, her voice sharp and cold as a blade. "There was no theft here, Mr. Croft. I simply carefully reviewed the system risk reports you deliberately buried, the numbers you forbade me from mentioning when I worked for you." He always thought money could cover up incompetence, and used his power to crush my family when I refused to compromise with his insatiable greed. Elara rose, walking slowly and steadily toward the father and daughter. Vivienne recoiled in fear, her false pride completely shattered as she faced the icy gaze of the woman she had once deliberately humiliated, pushing the takeover contract across the glass table. "Today, the order has officially changed. Sign this contract. Hand over full control of Croft Holdings to Thorne Capital, or I will send evidence of your fraudulent trust to the Federal Bureau of Investigation within 15 minutes. The choice is entirely yours." The atmosphere in Thorne Capital's central meeting room froze to the point of suffocation. Elara Vance's threat wasn't empty negotiation tactics or amateurish intimidation. It was a sharp death sentence for the entire Croft empire. Arthur Croft, the once powerful man who wielded fire in the financial district, now trembled like a dry leaf in a storm. His eyes darted wildly in panic, desperately searching for a last glimmer of hope from Silas Thorne, but all he received was an icy wall. His voice trembled, cold sweat beading on his forehead. "Silas, you can't let her do this to us. We're all businessmen. If information about that trust gets out, the entire market will collapse. You can take the company, take everything on the negotiating table, but please don't give that evidence to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I've dedicated my life to building this brand." Slowly approaching the glass table, his voice sharp and unforgiving. "You're completely mistaken, Arthur. I'm not playing your manipulative games, and I certainly won't tolerate fraudsters. The only person in this room who has the power to decide your fate is Elara. She devised this entire strategy, and she'll be the only one to decide whether you retain your freedom. Sign that paper immediately, or prepare to face a subpoena tomorrow morning." Arthur's hand trembled as he slowly picked up the gold-plated fountain pen. With a choked sob from deep within his throat, Arthur closed his eyes and signed his name on the fateful paper. A simple signature officially ended 3 generations of absolute power for the Croft family. Croft Holdings was now completely in a new owner. Vivian Croft stood silently in the corner, utterly stunned by the cruel reality. The world of privilege, the lavish parties of the upper class that she had always been so proud of, had been wiped out with a single stroke of the pen. Overwhelming fear quickly turned into despair. Ignoring her last shred of pride, she rushed toward Silas, desperately clinging to his arm, tears smudging her expensive makeup. Sobbing, her voice pleading pathetically. "Silas, please, are you going to abandon me? Abandon the relationship between our 2 families, all for this poor maid? I promise I'll change. I can help you run the company." Coldly pushing Vivian's hand away, he takes a handkerchief from his breast pocket and carefully wipes the spot where she's touched him. "You never belonged in my world, Vivienne. My world is built on intelligence, iron discipline, and genuine ability, things you can't buy with your inheritance. You call Alara a poor wretch, but she only took 2 weeks to destroy the entire fortune your family spent 3 generations building. Now, both of you, leave my building immediately. Arthur's face turned ashen, and he had to support his sobbing daughter. The two of them trudged out of the meeting room, carrying with them a deep sense of humiliation. In the silent room, Alara stood staring at the contract. The burden of her father's unjust debt, the humiliation she had to endure, all had been justly repaid. Breathing a sigh of relief, her gaze fixed on Silas. It's all over now. Croft Holdings is entirely his. Smiling slightly, his eyes filled with admiration. No, Alara, it's ours. And this is just the beginning. 6 months after the monumental acquisition of Croft Holdings, the biting winter winds had given way to a bright, promising spring in the financial district. The Vanguard Gala, once the exclusive playground of inherited wealth and old money, was now being hosted by Thorn Capital. The venue was deliberately stripped of the suffocating, ostentatious gold leaf and heavy drapery preferred by the Crofts. Instead, it was replaced by sleek, minimalist architecture and brilliant open lighting that reflected Silas Thorne's vision of a new, transparent era of meritocracy. Standing alone on the grand balcony, looking out over the glittering city skyline, she wears a stunning, understated midnight blue gown, projecting quiet, absolute authority. It's genuinely surreal, isn't it? 6 months ago, I was completely invisible to every single person in that room. I was nothing more than part of the background aesthetic, serving champagne to people who actively profited from my family's suffering. Now, they track my every movement, analyzing my investment strategies as if they were gospel. Stepping out onto the balcony from the shadows, handing her a crystal flute of sparkling water, he smiles, a genuine, warm expression rarely seen by the public. You were never invisible, Alara. They were simply too blinded by their own fragile egos and inherited privilege to recognize a titan standing in their midst. You didn't just dismantle a corrupt empire. You systematically rebuilt their shattered infrastructure into an entity that now fully funds the medical debt relief programs your father desperately needed. You forced this city to evolve. Inside the grand hall, the shifting power dynamics were on full display, painting a stark picture of the new world order. Arthur Croft, having narrowly avoided federal prison through a grueling plea deal that stripped him of his remaining assets, was nowhere to be seen. However, lingering near the back of the room, standing awkwardly by the catering tables, was Vivienne Croft. She wore a dress that was noticeably several seasons out of date, her posture stiff with the crushing weight of her new reality. She was desperately attempting to secure a junior public relations position, her previous arrogance completely hollowed out by the harsh realities of the working class she had once mercilessly mocked. Approaching a tech executive, her voice stripped of its former entitlement, sounding anxious, fragile, and quiet. Mr. Sterling, if you would just take a moment to review my portfolio, I assure you my previous connections. Well, my fundamental understanding of high-end demographics could be a significant asset to your marketing division. I am willing to start at the bottom. Politely but firmly stepping away, checking his watch. I appreciate the initiative, Miss Croft, but we are currently prioritizing candidates with direct, quantifiable structural experience and algorithmic proficiency. Enjoy the catering. Vivienne watched him walk away, the professional rejection stinging far worse than any spilled wine ever could. She looked across the room and caught sight of Alara and Silas re-entering from the balcony. The elite crowd naturally parted for them, a silent, undeniable testament to true power not inherited through a bloodline, but forged through intellect, extreme resilience, and unyielding discipline. Vivienne lowered her gaze, staring at the floor, finally understanding the profound lesson she had been taught. Catching Silas's eye, her tone steady, devoid of any lingering resentment, and entirely focused on the future. The executive board expects our international expansion strategy by Monday morning. The European markets are heavily fortified, and their primary lenders are relying on the exact same outdated tier 1 capital illusions the Crofts use to mask their toxic debt. Offering his arm to her, his eyes shining with predatory corporate anticipation and deep respect. Then I suppose we have a profoundly busy weekend ahead of us, Chief Strategy Officer. Let them fortify their walls. We already know exactly how to tear them down. As they walk together to the center of the ballroom, the camera slowly pans up to the glass ceiling, reflecting a city forever changed by a woman who refused to be broken, and the billionaire who was intelligent enough to choose an intellectual equal over a fragile pawn.